My mother-in-law spent 3 years trying to destroy my marriage from the inside. Told my husband I was cheating, that I was after his money, that I didn't love him. And when my husband finally believed her and asked for a divorce, she didn't know I had saved every message, every voicemail, and every lie she had ever told. The day my husband asked me for a divorce, I didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt in a way that has no name, the kind that hits you in the center of your chest and takes your breath away. But in the second he said the words, I saw something in his face that froze me more than the words themselves. I saw his mother. Not literally. He was alone in front of me, eyes red, jaw tight, telling me he couldn't continue, that there were things he couldn't ignore anymore, that he needed space to think. But I heard his mother in every word, because I knew those words. I had heard them before, in another voice, in another tone, in messages I had been saving for 3 years, because something in me knew from the very beginning that one day I was going to need them. That day had come. My name is Valentina. I'm 32 years old. I've been married to Rodrigo for 5 years. He's an architect with a smile that still disarms me even in the middle of an argument, and who for 3 years of our marriage was being slowly poisoned by the one person who was supposed to want him to be happy. His mother. His mother's name is Hortensia. She's 58 years old, lives 20 minutes from our house, and from the very first day Rodrigo introduced me as his girlfriend, something in her eyes told me I was a problem she intended to solve. She didn't say it in words that first day. She said it with a smile that never reached her eyes, with a question about my family that had the tone of an audit, with the way she looked at Rodrigo after looking at me, as if assessing whether her son had made a mistake. I noticed. Rodrigo didn't. And that difference in perception was the crack through which Hortensia entered over the years that followed. The first few months were subtle, so subtle that I questioned myself constantly. It was the call Hortensia made to Rodrigo at exactly the wrong moment. A romantic dinner, a difficult conversation we had finally decided to have. One of those moments that build marriages. The phone would ring, and it was her, with something that seemed urgent in the moment and turned out not to be. It was the small, almost innocent comment dropped into family conversations. That I seemed very independent, said in a tone that made independence sound like a flaw. That women today have very different priorities than before, said with a sideways glance at me. That Rodrigo had always been very devoted in his relationships, and she hoped that was being reciprocated, said directly to me, with a smile. It was the way she reframed everything I did. If I worked a lot, it was because I didn't prioritize Rodrigo. If I went out with friends, it was because I preferred my life before the marriage. If I didn't call Hortensia often enough, it was a sign that I didn't feel like part of the family. Nothing was enough evidence alone. But together it all built a narrative. I let the first year pass because I thought it was an adjustment period. That Hortensia needed time to accept me. That with patience and goodwill things would improve. The second year, I started documenting. Not because I had a specific plan, but because I'm an organized person by nature, because I had learned at work that records matter, and because something instinctive in me said that what was happening was more serious than I wanted to admit. I saved screenshots of messages Hortensia sent Rodrigo when I could see them. Messages in which she implied things about me without saying them directly. Messages in which she asked Rodrigo whether I truly made him happy, as if the obvious answer were no. Messages in which she mentioned Rodrigo's past relationships with a warm nostalgia that had no reason to exist in the context of a happy marriage. I saved the voice messages Hortensia sent Rodrigo that he sometimes showed me without realizing he was handing me evidence. In those messages, there were more direct things, that I spent too much money, that my friends were a bad influence, that she had spoken to someone who knew me from before and they had told her things that worried her. Things that worried her, without specifying what, without names, without evidence, just the insinuation floating in the air, vague enough to be impossible to challenge, but specific enough to leave a stain. The third year, things escalated. I don't know exactly what changed. Maybe Hortensia felt that time was passing, and I was still there, and her slow erosion strategy wasn't working as quickly as she had hoped. Maybe something in our dynamic told her Rodrigo and I were doing well, and that alarmed her instead of reassuring her. What I know is that the insinuations became accusations. Rodrigo started coming home with a new kind of tension. A tension I couldn't locate at first, but that over time I learned to recognize. It was the tension of someone who has just heard something disturbing and doesn't know whether to believe it or dismiss it. It was the tension of someone processing a doubt that hadn't existed before. The conversations we had during that period had a pattern. Rodrigo would ask a question that seemed casual, but had an undercurrent I could feel without being able to name. About my outings, about my schedule, about a coworker I had mentioned once whose name Rodrigo remembered with a precision that wasn't natural for someone who wasn't paying unusual attention. One night, I asked him directly if his mother had said something about me. He looked at me for a second too long. He said no, and I knew he was lying, not to protect her, but to protect me from something he wasn't ready to say yet. The real conversation came on a Saturday in March. Rodrigo came home from visiting his mother with that face. The face I already knew. He sat across from me in the living room and told me we needed to talk. He told me his mother had said she had evidence that I was being unfaithful, that she had seen messages, that she had spoken to someone who had seen me with another man, that she had been holding on to the information for a while because she didn't want to hurt him, but she could no longer stay quiet. I listened to all of it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself immediately. I asked him if he believed her. There was a pause that lasted too long. He said he didn't know, that there were things that didn't add up, that he needed time to process. That night, I slept in the guest room, not because he asked me to, but because I needed space to think clearly. And lying there in the dark, I thought about the folders. I asked for a week. I told him I didn't want to make any big decisions in the heat of the moment, that we both needed to lower the temperature, and that after that week, I wanted to have a conversation, but a conversation with everything on the table. Rodrigo agreed. That week I didn't argue. I didn't insist. I didn't call Hortensia. I didn't ask anyone for explanations. That week I prepared everything. I organized 3 years of documentation into a clear chronological order. Screenshots with dates and times. Audio messages. Emails in which Hortensia had copied other family members into conversations about me. The record of my locations on the specific dates when, according to Hortensia, I was supposedly somewhere that proved her story, locations that my work records, my transit receipts, and the security cameras in my office building showed were impossible. And something else. Something I found when I started asking questions I hadn't asked before. A conversation between Hortensia and Rodrigo's ex-girlfriend. A conversation on social media that someone had mentioned to me months earlier and to which I had paid no attention at the time, but which now, seen in context, was revealing. Hortensia maintained an active, warm relationship with Rodrigo's ex. She messaged her regularly. She asked how she was doing. She told her she would always be part of the family. An ex-girlfriend who, coincidentally, had appeared in Hortensia's story to Rodrigo as the person who had supposedly seen me with another man. It was not a coincidence. It was an operation. Small, domestic, without physical violence, but an operation, with coordinated participants and a narrative built patiently over years. The conversation with Rodrigo lasted 4 hours. I showed him everything in order, without drama, without shouting, with the clarity of someone who has prepared a presentation and knows exactly what they want to communicate. I showed him his mother's messages. I showed him the pattern I had documented over 3 years. I showed him the dates and locations that dismantled the infidelity story. I showed him the conversation between his mother and his ex-girlfriend. Rodrigo didn't say anything for a long time. When he spoke, the first thing he said was that he was sorry. The second was that he needed to call his mother. I listened to that call because Rodrigo asked me to. He told me he wanted me present, that he didn't want any more conversations I couldn't see. Rodrigo showed Hortensia the evidence over a video call. He asked her directly about the messages, about the ex-girlfriend, about the accusations. Hortensia denied everything at first. Then she said she was only protecting him. Then she cried. Then she said I had manipulated him to turn him against her. Then she said a mother always knows when someone is not right for her son. Rodrigo told her he needed time and ended the call. He sat in silence for a while. Then he looked at me and said, "How long have you been keeping all of this?" 3 years, I said. He asked me why I hadn't told him anything before. I told him the truth, because if I had told him without proof, he would have had to choose between believing me or believing her. And that wasn't a fair choice to put on him. I wanted it so that when the moment came, he wouldn't have to choose between two versions. I wanted him to be able to see the truth for himself. He took my hand. He didn't say anything else that day. He didn't need to. 7 months have passed since that conversation. Rodrigo and Hortensia haven't spoken normally since then. There's been contact because Rodrigo is not the kind of person who cuts ties abruptly, but it is different contact, more distant, with boundaries that didn't exist before and that Hortensia now has to respect whether she likes it or not. Rodrigo went to therapy. First alone, then together. Not because our marriage was broken, but because what had happened showed both of us things we needed to learn. Him to trust his own perception and not only his mother's, me to speak up sooner instead of documenting in silence and waiting. That was the hardest thing for me to accept. That my instinct to document and wait, which in the end proved useful, was also a way of not facing the problem directly, of protecting myself by accumulating evidence instead of having uncomfortable conversations in time. I learned that. It took me a while, but I learned it. Hortensia and I have no real relationship. We see each other on important dates because Rodrigo values them, and I respect that. We greet each other with a politeness neither of us feels, but that both of us maintain for him. She knows that I know everything she did, and I know that she knows that I know. And in that shared knowledge, there's a kind of cold equilibrium that, if it isn't peace, is at least stability. Rodrigo asked me once if I forgave her. I told him that wasn't a question I could answer yet. That forgiveness is a process, not a decision, and that I wasn't going to rush the process to give him an answer that felt good but wasn't real. He understood. What I did tell him is that I'm glad I stayed. That I didn't leave that night when he asked me for a divorce. That I had the presence of mind to say, wait, there is something you need to see. Because what I built with Rodrigo is real. 5 years, a life, a shared history. And that is worth defending. Not with violence, not with revenge, with evidence, with patience, and with the certainty that the truth, when it is well documented, speaks for itself. It always speaks for itself. If this story moved you, comment. Would you have waited or confronted sooner? Like if you believe protecting your marriage is not selfishness. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone going through something similar who needs to know they're not alone. Advice. If you feel someone is quietly working to damage your relationship, document calmly and talk to your partner soon. Evidence without conversation is armor. Conversation without evidence is a gamble. The best approach is to have both.